There's a classic James Brown song, It's a Man's World. And indeed, when it comes to football and the world of media, it is pretty much a man's world. But even men find it very difficult to swim among the sharks. They tend to be afraid, gagged, or basically switch to survival mode. But every once in a while, you find that man who steps up and goes against the current and breaks a big story, because it's a man's world. So, my next guest is a woman who not only has carved a name for herself in a man's world, actually took courage from losing her job to threats on her life. Celestine Olilo joins us at the Social House Nairobi for the funny, raw, and real football show. Just to make it clear, this one is raw and extremely real. Give me the story, the background, where it all started for you.
So it started very early in his tenure. I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks after he'd been elected into power. Because the moment he got into power, it got into his head, sorry to say. And I came to realize that it's just a character flaw from which he later became his downfall. There was this story about that in the women's national team, because that was the first time that we had a tiff with Nick, which was not really supposed to be a tiff because it was something that was done behind his back. There was a coach that was fired and another one brought in unprocedurally, and I wrote that story. And he seemed to be very upset with it, and I was perturbed because I didn't expect him to react that way. First of all, it was something that it's not him who did it, but the fact that he touched on his office and it was a negative story seemed to piss him off so much that he saw it fit to call me and shout at me and actually even hurl expletives. So after that, now our relationship got off to a very rocky start, because I think that was the first time that we had a professional interaction, aside from the day that he came into power, the day that he won the elections. After that, so many other stories came about. There was the issue of the OB van, from where 125 million got lost. And then the big one, which was the 244 million that was given to the national team for AFCON preps, and also their stay in Egypt for the Africa Cup of Nations. I think that was the beginning of his downfall, because after that it's when now people started to cast a real spotlight on the management of funds in the federation. It is the day that people realized that there's actually different accounts from which the federation operates from, and only one person knows which accounts those are. Around that time that also the ministry came to actually pin it down that the federation is receiving funds for things that they are actually paid for, some by CAF, some by other sponsors that they had, because they had corporate sponsors at that time because they were representing the country at the Africa Cup of Nations. When I wrote that story, and luckily my editors at that time saw it fit to that story cannot go into the back pages, because I remember very correctly, I was investigating that story alongside my colleague Samuel Gasharira, and we had sat on the documents for such a long time because we were scared, and also we didn't have enough proof. So we wanted proof that this information is correct, because someone had leaked that story onto us, and we weren't sure if it was just normal bar talk or it was actually the truth. But when we got the documents, you see, we had to get clarification from the federation. And one thing you know about the federation, and it's not just the Football Kenya Federation, all federations in the world, they are very protected by FIFA. So they can actually decline to give you any confirmation, and you will do nothing about it. So we knew that to crack this code, we have to get the federation to actually confirm or deny whether or not these documents are legitimate. Luckily, when I went to the federation, they were so confident that story, that we didn't have anything that would pin them down, that they allowed us access to even more documents, because they knew that we couldn't be able to figure it out, because they thought that they've hidden their stuff so well that there's no way we could figure it out. In fact, so they gave us a whole room, and they were gracious enough. In fact, I was very happy because we didn't expect that kind of response from them. But they were so confident that we wouldn't find anything. So they gave us files upon files upon files upon files. We hadn't told them that we have the documents already. We just wanted to confirm. So we went through the files, and they kept coming and checking and asking, are you guys seeing anything? I was like, just give us a few minutes. We just go through the files. So we went through the files, and we confirmed that the documents that we have actually the same ones that are in the federation. And actually, we found even more evidence of criminal things that were going on in the federation in terms of money movement. So we went back to the office, having gotten our clarification from the CEO. We had our story. We did a 3-part series. When I took it to my bosses, they were like, this is not a story for the back pages. This is actually a corruption scandal, a major, and one of the biggest that ever happened in football. This story is going to the front page. So it went on the front page on Monday morning. And I remember that morning, one of the people from the federation called me early in the morning. Sele umetuweka front page. I didn't even know. I didn't even seen the story myself because I hadn't read the paper. I'm not an early riser. So I didn't even see the paper. So I was like, umetuweka front page. And there began a series of calls. Most of them were anonymous because they knew that I was recording those calls. I was just being harassed, I would say. Why have you written this story? That was not even the first time they had called me. Initially, when I was doing the other exposés about the Obi-Wan and the things that were happening within the women's national team, I had received several calls. Initially, Nick is the one who used to call me himself to complain about my coverage of the story and why I didn't give the federation right of reply. I told him not to talk to me, to go and talk to my bosses because I don't write for myself, I write for the media house, and it's the media house that gave me permission to write that story. So he stopped calling me. Also, I think he felt that I was too junior for him to relate with me, so he sent other people to talk to me, or rather other people saw it fit to talk to me about my coverage of events. So I remember the first time that I got a really major scare is a day I had written about the women's national team, something I can't remember now. But that person called me, and he had a really scruffy voice, very scruffy. It was like those voices you hear in the movies. It's like someone is calling you, and they're seriously angry. And it's a man. After asking me why I'm writing bad things about the federation, and I asked them, am I writing bad things about the federation or am I writing untrue things? Because if it's the latter, I have a case to answer. If it's just bad things and they're correct, then I'm doing my job. And he didn't even want to hear my explanation. He was there to pass a message that he knows where I live. Now, Chiko, when you're a woman, and someone with that kind of voice tells you that they know where you live, and it's a story you have written, which is actually your job, and you know bad things have happened to journalists before, you get very scared. I try to be strong because by nature, I usually don't take threats very seriously because, well, I could say I'm usually strong. I'm not those people who are pushovers, or rather I think of myself that way. But I was very scared that day. I got really scared. Actually, I packed a small bag because in the evening, when it was all quiet, I started thinking, am I ready to lose my life or to have my body harmed because of a story? I was like, no. I packed a small bag, went to sleep at my parents' place. Luckily, they don't live very far from me. And it was while at my parents' house wondering, for a story I have written that is actually true, this cannot be happening. So in the morning, I decided that if they're going to call me again, if they're ever going to call me again to demand, to talk about my stories, I'm going to tell them to now just go the legal way. Because I wasn't going to stop writing about football. Because I was convinced that part of the reason why we are here in terms of football is because people don't want to stand up to the management. People don't want to talk to and partly it's a moral issue, partly it's a survival issue. Journalists in this country, especially sports journalists, they like to pander to their management. I used to wonder why, but now I understand fully, having been there for the last 9 years.
9 years, you say, right? So if you've been around for 9 years doing the same job, you've worked under the two regimes that are most recent. What's the difference between those two?
Both leaders had their flaws. Sam Nyamwaya had his flaws, major ones. Nick Mwenda had his flaws, major ones, but there was a difference in terms of emotional intelligence, relating with people. The way that Nick Mwenda related with people, not just journalists, but stakeholders, all stakeholders, government, ministry, even sponsors, even players of the national team, and the way that Sam Nyamwaya used to relate with the stakeholders was completely different. Sam Nyamwaya knew how to talk to people. Yes, he had his flaws, and there were serious flaws that actually at some point landed him in custody. But he knew how to relate with people. He knew the pain points of people, and he used to address things as soon as they happened. He never used to threaten anybody. He would call you and let's have this discussion. He never, even if he's lying, he knew how to do it in a smart way. The other person, the federation head that just left office, was different. Him, it was either his way or the highway. And you see, when you're working with people and you are the only one who knows and everybody else does not know anything and it always has to go your way, then you have a problem. The other thing was that the previous regime acknowledged that there was no way the federation could operate on its own. And so he allowed other people like the Kenya Premier League company to run the league. He allowed he virtually wasn't the be-all and all that.
Now, back to the two regimes you actually referred to. Both were fighting to have ownership and run the league. Do you think this is something we need to move away from?
Absolutely, you cannot do everything. There's no way you can do everything and do it well. It's just not possible. It's not humanly possible. Even you in your house, you don't do the cleaning and the cooking and paying the school. You delegate all these things to different people. There's nobody who can do everything and do it well. We saw it has worked before when the Kenyan Premier League was in charge of running the league. We have seen what has happened now that the federation is trying to gain control of everything. It cannot work because running a league, especially running the top flight league, takes a lot. You need to worry about getting sponsorship. You need to worry about marketing the league. You need to worry about media interactions. You need to worry about the welfare of the players. You need to worry about the growth of the league itself. There's no way that if the one person or one organization can focus on the top flight league, on the NSL, on the women's football, and there are 3 tiers of there's no way it can happen. And we've seen it being done in Europe. The federation doesn't take care. Doesn't meddle in the league. And so why are we trying to invent the league? It's this inherent and pervasive perception that we have to be in control of everything. Otherwise, we are not going to be visible. And that's the wrong way to do things.
You know, it's interesting you should say that because I agree with you. Journalists do live in fear. But it's just not a substantiated fear. You know the horror stories that they faced under this regime if you're in the wrong books. Tell us some.
Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. And that is what happened in the previous regime. Watu wameona mengi sana, journalists especially in the previous regime. Some of them might not be able to talk about the issues that they went to. But I remember, like, my colleagues, because we've had these discussions before, there was a time one of my colleagues, I'm not going to mention his name, but he's left the industry now. He's on his way to becoming a priest. He left the profession. There was a day he went to cover a press conference. And it came, I think, a few days after he'd written something negative about the federation. And it was a luncheon, and journalists were eating just before just before the press conference. And 2 men just came to where this colleague of mine was sitting, and he had just served food, and he just placed the food on his table. And they came and they told this gentleman that you have to leave the premises. And he was like, why? We don't want people here who do not understand what we're doing and who are writing bad things about us in the media. And the gentleman had to leave. So when he came back to the office and told us that he did not have a story because he could not attend the press conference, his main concern was, I had just started eating when these guys removed me. There was also a time my colleague, senior colleague Charles Nyende, I'm mentioning his name because he's also been very vocal about it. He's written about it. He went to the Africa Cup of Nations in Egypt, accompanying the national team. And he went to interview the coach at that time. The first interview that the coach held with journalists just before playing the first match. And the coach refused to answer his questions. And when he asked why, he was like, I've been told not to take questions from journalists from Nation Media Group. And that was it. That Charles Nyende struggled to find in team news throughout his stay in Egypt because the coach and the players had been told not to speak to any journalist from the Nation Media Group. Luckily, he's very smart and he's a professional, so he still got his stories, but it was very difficult for him. In my experience, it got to a point where everybody had been told, do not pick any call from Celeste, because they knew that if it is true, it's going to appear somewhere in the media. And so to safeguard their space and to ensure that no bad news leaks out to the public, they were players, especially players, because players are easy to manipulate. You just tell them that you're not going to invite you to the national team next time, and they keep quiet. Or you tell them that we'll sanction you like this and like that. And because they are very scared not to lose their positions, then they will be able to, especially women. So most of them had been told not to talk to me. So anytime I'd want to get a story, it was very difficult because they either agreed to speak to me either as an anonymous source or they did not speak to me at all. Even the coaches, and it was very difficult for me to do my job. But here we are.
Absolutely, resilience.